The year was 1873. In the dust-choked town of Harlow Creek, Arizona, there lived a man so feared, so avoided, that mothers pulled their children indoors when his shadow fell across the street. His name was Silas Kane, and he hadn't heard a woman's voice, not directed at him, not spoken kindly, in over 11 years. They said he was cursed. They said something lived behind his eyes that wasn't entirely human. They said the last woman who got close to him ended up buried under the cottonwood tree behind his ranch. That wasn't true. None of it was true. But the truth didn't matter in Harlow Creek. Fear was the only currency that never lost its value. So when a woman appeared at the iron gate of his ranch one scorching afternoon in July, a woman no one had ever seen before, thin as a whisper, dressed in dust-covered black, and spoke 7 words that stopped his heart dead. "Please, sir, I am asking you, marry me." The whole town held its breath. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why on God's burning earth, would any woman walk toward the one man every living soul walked away from? Before we begin this story, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country, your city. I'm sending love your way, wherever you are. Now settle in. Because this story, this dark, beautiful, heartbreaking story, is not what you think it is. Not even close. Let's begin. Silas Kane was not born a monster. He was born the 3rd son of a cattle rancher named Josiah Kane. A hard man, but a fair one, who worked the land south of Harlow Creek with hands that had never known rest. Josiah raised his boys the way the desert raised everything, with pressure, heat, and very little mercy. But he loved them. He loved them deeply. He just never figured out how to say it. Silas was different from his brothers. Where Thomas and Virgil were loud, reckless, full of laughter that rang across the canyons, Silas was quiet, watchful. He could sit on the porch for 3 hours without saying a word, just watching the light change across the mesa. His mother, Eliza, used to say he was listening to something the rest of US can't hear. She died when Silas was 12. Typhoid took her in 6 days. 6 days of fever, delirium, and whispered prayers. Silas didn't leave her bedside once. Not once. His brothers went out to the barn and cried where no one could see them. His father rode into the desert alone and didn't come back for 2 days. But Silas stayed. He held her hand. He watched the life leave her the way you watch the last flame of a candle surrender to the dark. Something changed in him after that. Not something dramatic. Not some violent transformation. Just a quiet withdrawal. Like a river pulling back from its banks. He spoke less. Smiled less. His eyes, already serious for a boy his age, took on a weight that made grown men uncomfortable. By the time Silas was 20, his father was dead too. A horse threw him on a rocky trail and his neck snapped like a dry branch. Thomas took over the ranch. Virgil left for California. And Silas built a smaller ranch on the eastern edge of Harlow Creek. Up against the foothills, surrounded by iron fencing, he welded himself. He raised cattle. He broke horses. He kept to himself. And the town let him be. For a while. The trouble started the year Silas turned 25. A woman named Clara Hutchins, the schoolteacher's daughter, young, bright-eyed, full of that reckless courage that comes from never having been truly hurt, took a liking to him. She'd see him in town buying supplies, and she'd smile at him. He'd nod. That was it. That was their entire courtship for 3 months. Smiles and nods. But Clara was persistent. One afternoon, she walked out to his ranch uninvited, carrying a basket of bread and jarred peaches. She knocked on his door, and when he opened it, confused, suspicious, a shotgun loosely held at his side because that was how you answered a door in the territory, she just smiled and said, "I thought you might be hungry." He let her in. They talked for 2 hours. It was the most Silas had spoken since his mother died. Clara had this way about her, warm, unhurried, patient. She didn't press him. She didn't try to fill his silences. She just sat with him, and something in his chest, something locked and rusted shut for years, began to creak open. They saw each other twice a week for 2 months. And then Clara vanished. Not dramatically, not violently. She simply stopped coming. Stopped smiling at him in town. Crossed the street when she saw him. Wouldn't meet his eyes. Silas didn't understand. He went to her father's house and knocked. Her father, a thin, nervous man named Hutchins, opened the door and said 5 words that Silas would never forget. "Stay away from my daughter." The door closed. Silas stood there for a long time, the desert wind pulling at his coat, and then he walked home. He found out later, through whispers, through fragments, that someone in town had told Clara about what really happened to his mother. That Silas had been alone with her when she died. That no one else had been present. That maybe, just maybe, a 12-year-old boy who was too quiet and too strange had done something unnatural. It was a lie. A monstrous, baseless lie. But it spread the way lies do in small towns. Like fire through dry brush, unstoppable and indiscriminate. And just like that, Silas Kane became the man no woman would touch. The man every woman ran from. He was 25 years old, and he was already a ghost. 18 years passed. 18 years of silence. 18 years of iron fences and solitary meals and conversations held only with horses who didn't judge and cattle who didn't whisper. Silas Kane was 43 years old, and he had made peace with his isolation the way a prisoner makes peace with his cell. Not with acceptance, but with the slow erosion of hope until what remained was something that looked like calm but was really just exhaustion. Harlow Creek had grown. A railroad spur now connected it to Tucson. New families arrived. New buildings went up. Proper courthouse. A second saloon. A telegraph office. The town was respectable now, or at least it wore respectability like a borrowed coat. But the story of Silas Kane hadn't changed. If anything, it had grown. The whispers had calcified into legend. New versions of the lie circulated with the regularity of seasons. He'd killed his mother. He'd killed a drifter. He'd buried someone or several someones under that cottonwood tree on his property. Children dared each other to touch his fence. Teenagers carved warnings into the wooden posts along the road to his ranch. Even the new sheriff, a transplant from Missouri named Garrett Cole, had paid him a visit in his first week to introduce himself, which really meant to size him up, to look into his eyes and decide whether the stories were true. Silas let him look. The sheriff left without a word. It was a Tuesday in July when she appeared. The heat that day was biblical. The kind of heat that made the air itself look sick, wavering and distorted above the cracked earth. Nothing moved. Even the lizards had retreated into shadow. Silas was in his barn, mending a saddle, when he heard the gate rattle. He didn't get visitors. Ever. Occasionally, a ranch hand from one of the larger outfits would come by looking for stray cattle, but they always announced themselves from a distance. Loudly, nervously, the way you'd call out near a predator's den. This was different. This was quiet. He set down the saddle and walked out into the light, squinting against the glare. And there she was, a woman, standing at his gate. Both hands wrapped around the iron bars like she was holding herself up. She was thin, alarmingly thin, with dark hair falling loose around a face that was sun-darkened and angular. Her dress was black, faded to a dark gray in places, and it was covered in trail dust so thick it looked like she'd walked through a sandstorm. Her boots were falling apart. Her lips were cracked. But her eyes were clear, focused, burning with something that Silas couldn't name but recognized immediately. Desperation. Not the wild, flailing desperation of panic. Something quieter. Something deeper. The desperation of someone who has already accepted the worst and is now operating on the other side of fear. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither spoke. Then she opened her mouth, and her voice came out cracked and dry, barely above a whisper. "Please, sir, I am asking you. Marry me." Silas didn't move. He didn't blink. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind shifting dust across the yard. "You lost," he finally said. "No. You know who I am? Silas Kane. Then you know what they say about me." "I know what they say. And you're still standing there." "I'm still standing here." He studied her. She wasn't young, maybe 30, maybe older. hard to tell with the desert's damage written into her skin. But she stood straight despite her exhaustion, and she met his gaze without flinching, and that alone told him more about her than any words could. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nara. Nara Dunhill." He'd never heard the name. She wasn't from Harlow Creek. Wasn't from any town nearby, judging by the state of her clothes and the depth of her fatigue. "You need water," he said. "I need a husband." "You need water first." He opened the gate. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and then stepped through. He led her to the porch, sat her in the chair, and brought her a tin cup of water from the well. She drank it in 4 swallows. He refilled it. She drank again. Then she looked up at him with those burning, exhausted, impossibly steady eyes and said, "I'll explain everything. I'll tell you why. But I need your answer first." Silas leaned against the porch post, crossed his arms, and looked out at the empty desert. "Lady," he said quietly, "I haven't spoken to a woman in 11 years, and the last one who got close ran like I was the devil himself." He paused. "So before I give you any answer, you're going to tell me exactly who you are, exactly where you came from, and exactly why a woman who clearly has no business being in this territory walked across God knows how many miles to propose marriage to a man the whole world calls a murderer." Nara Dunhill sat down. "The tin cup. That," she said, "is going to take a while. I've got nothing but time." Nara Dunhill was born in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1842. Her father was a clerk in a shipping company. Her mother was a seamstress who took in laundry on the side. They were poor, not destitute, but the kind of poor where every meal was a small negotiation with fate, and a broken shoe was a family crisis. She told Silas this sitting on his porch as the sun slid toward the mesa, her voice steady, her hands folded in her lap as if she were testifying in court. She was the oldest of 4 children, 2 sisters, 1 brother. She raised them as much as her mother did because her mother was always working, always bent over fabric or a washboard, always tired in a way that went deeper than the body. When Nara was 17, her father died. Pneumonia. He went from coffin to coffin in 9 days. The shipping company sent a letter of condolence and nothing else. Nara went to work. She cleaned houses for wealthy families along the riverfront. She scrubbed floors, polished silver, washed windows so clear they disappeared. She worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, and brought home every cent. At 19, she married a man named Douglas Pruitt. She said his name the way you say the name of a disease you survived, carefully, with the memory of pain still living in the syllables. Douglas was a farrier, a man who shoed horses. He was handsome in a rough, unfinished way, with strong hands and a smile that made promises his character couldn't keep. He courted Nara with patience and small gifts, a ribbon, a carved wooden bird, a single wildflower left on her doorstep. She thought he was kind. She thought he was steady. She was wrong. The first time Douglas hit her was 3 months after the wedding. She had burned the cornbread. He backhanded her so hard she saw light behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the sun. Then he apologized. Then he cried. Then he promised it would never happen again. It happened again, and again, and again. Nara paused here. She looked at her hands. The silence on that porch was so heavy Silas could feel it pressing against his chest. "I stayed for 6 years, she said, because I didn't know how to leave, because my mother told me marriage was sacred, because I thought if I was better, quieter, smaller, more careful, he would stop. He didn't stop. The violence escalated. Bruises became fractures. Apologies became accusations. He told her she was worthless. He told her no one else would ever want her. He told her she was lucky he hadn't killed her. In 1867, Nara gave birth to a daughter. She named her Lily. For a brief, shimmering moment, Douglas softened. He held the baby with something approaching tenderness. He looked at Nara and said, "We'll be better now." And she wanted God, how she wanted to believe him. The peace lasted 4 months. Then one night, Lily wouldn't stop crying. Colic, most likely. Douglas had been drinking. He stood up from his chair, crossed the room, and raised his hand over the cradle. Something broke inside Nara. Not the fragile, wounded thing that had been breaking slowly for years. Something else. Something structural. Something load-bearing. She felt it snap like a beam in a burning building, and suddenly she was on her feet, and she had the iron poker from the fireplace in her hand, and she was standing between Douglas and the cradle with a look in her eyes that even a drunk man could read. "Touch her," Nara whispered, "and I will end you." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 6 years he backed down. But Nara knew. She knew with the clarity that only comes at the edge of catastrophe. This wasn't over. This would never be over. Not as long as she stayed. 3 nights later, while Douglas slept off another bottle of whiskey, Nara packed a single bag, wrapped Lily against her chest, and walked out the door into the Missouri darkness. She didn't look back. She traveled south, then west. She worked wherever she could. Kitchens, laundries, a ranch in Kansas where she learned to mend fences and doctor cattle. She changed her name twice. She kept moving because she heard, through whispered networks of women who understood, that Douglas was looking for her. Not because he loved her, because she was his property, and he didn't tolerate theft. She ended up in New Mexico, working on a ranch owned by a widow named Cowboy. For 3 years it was good. Lily grew. Nara felt something she barely recognized. Safety. Then Douglas found her. He rode in one morning with 2 men. They took Lily. They beat Nara so badly the widow Calloway thought she was dead. They left her in the dirt and rode east. By the time Nara could walk again, 6 weeks later, Douglas and Lily had vanished. The trail went cold in Texas. She searched for 2 years. Spent every penny. Followed every rumor. Nothing. She paused again. The desert had gone golden around them. The light thick and heavy. "I found out last month," she said. "He's here. In Arizona Territory. A town called Copperton, 30 miles north. He's working for a mining outfit. And he has Lily." Silas was quiet for a long time. "And the marriage?" he asked. Nara looked at him with those clear, burning eyes. "A married woman has standing in court. A lone woman, an unmarried woman, has nothing. No judge in this territory will hear a custody claim from a woman with no husband, no home, and no name anyone recognizes." She paused. "But a woman married to a landowning man, a man with property and roots, that woman has a voice. That woman can petition a court. That woman can get her daughter back." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Silas had ever heard. "So you don't want me," he said. Not bitterly, just factually. "I want my daughter," Nara said. "And I am willing to do anything to get her back, including marrying a man the whole world calls a monster." She met his eyes. No offense. None taken. Silas didn't answer her that night. He showed her to the small room at the back of the house, the one that had been his mother's sewing room decades ago, still smelling faintly of cedar and dust and the ghost of lavender sachets. He gave her a clean blanket and a pillow that had seen better days, and he told her to sleep. "We'll talk in the morning," he said. He closed the door and walked back to the porch and sat there in the dark for a very long time. The stars overhead were savage in their clarity. A million cold lights burning in a sky that offered no guidance and no comfort. He thought about Clara Hutchins, about her smile disappearing, about her father's 5 cold words, about the 18 years of silence that followed, each year stacking on top of the last like bricks in a wall he hadn't asked anyone to build. He thought about the lie, the original lie that he had somehow harmed his own mother. He'd never found out who started it. He had suspicions. Old man Bartlett, who'd had a land dispute with his father. Or maybe the Whedon family who'd wanted the cane grazing rights. It didn't matter. The lie had taken on its own life, grown its own legs, and walked through Harlow Creek with the confidence of truth. And now this woman, this battered, exhausted, extraordinary woman, was asking him to do the one thing the world had decided he was unworthy of. She was asking him to be a husband. Not a real one, maybe. Not in the way he'd once dreamed about in his younger years, when he still believed someone might look at him and see something worth loving. But a husband on paper. A name on a document. A legal shield. She was asking him to be useful. And God help him, that was more than anyone had asked of him in 18 years. In the morning he cooked breakfast. Eggs, salt pork, biscuits that were slightly burned on the bottom because he'd been distracted. He set a plate in front of Nara when she emerged, bleary-eyed and uncertain, and he poured her coffee and sat down across from her. "I'll do it," he said. She stopped chewing. "You will. On conditions." She set down her fork. "Name them. First, you tell me the truth. About everything. If there's something you're not telling me, something dangerous, something that could bring trouble to my door, I need to know now." "There's nothing. I've told you everything." "Second, when it's done, when you have your daughter back, you're free to go. I won't hold you. I won't claim you owe me anything. You walk away clean." She stared at him. Something moved across her face, surprise maybe, or something softer. "Agreed. Third," he paused. "If it comes to a fight, if this Douglas Pruitt shows up at my gate with guns and grievances, I need to know you're prepared for what that looks like." "He'll come," Nara said quietly. "He'll definitely come. Then I need you to understand something about me." Silas leaned forward. "I am not a murderer. I never was. But I am not a gentleman either. I have survived alone in this territory for almost 2 decades because I am very, very difficult to kill. If your husband, your former husband, brings violence to my home, I will answer it. And I will not answer it politely." Nara looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she nodded. "I understand." "Good." They were married that afternoon. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher named Father Moran, who traveled through Harlow Creek every 3 weeks. Silas met him in town and asked him directly, without preamble or explanation. The preacher, a weary man who had learned long ago not to question the Lord's timing or his taste in couples, agreed. They stood in the small church at the edge of town, just the two of them and Father Moran and an elderly woman named Agnes who served as witness because the law required one. Silas wore his cleanest shirt, which wasn't particularly clean. Nara wore her black dress, brushed free of trail dust. They exchanged vows that felt like contracts. They signed the register. Father Moran pronounced them married, and the word landed in the empty church like a stone in still water. No one kissed. No one celebrated. They walked back to the ranch in silence, side by side, and the space between them was both narrow and infinite. The town found out within hours. Of course it did. Agnes told the grocer. The grocer told his wife. His wife told the women at the well. By sundown, every soul in Harlow Creek knew that Silas Kane, the monster, the recluse, the murderer of legend, had taken a wife. The reactions were predictable. Shock, disbelief, dark amusement, and beneath all of it, a current of something uglier. Resentment. Because the story of Silas Kane only worked if he remained alone. If he remained punished. A man who finds companionship despite the world's rejection isn't a monster anymore. He's a mirror. And nobody wants to look into a mirror that shows them their own cruelty. The whispers sharpened. New theories emerged. He'd bought her. He'd kidnapped her. She was crazy. She was a criminal running from the law. She was as dangerous as he was. Nara heard the whispers when she went to town for supplies 3 days later. She heard them in the dry goods store, where 2 women stopped talking the instant she entered. She heard them at the water pump, where a man looked at her ring finger and then at her face with an expression of theatrical pity. She bought her supplies. She loaded them onto the mule. And as she was leaving, a woman, the banker's wife, a woman named Delia Forrest, stepped into her path and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "You poor thing. You must be truly desperate to shackle yourself to that creature." Nara looked at her, calmly, steadily. "Mrs. Forrest," she said, "I have been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. I have walked 400 miles across desert that would kill most men. I have lost everything I have ever loved." She paused. "The only creature I fear in this world is the one who took my daughter. And I promise you, ma'am, that creature is not Silas Kane." She walked past Delia Forest and did not look back. By the time she got home, the story had already spread through town like wildfire. And for the first time in 18 years, people in Harlow Creek weren't just talking about Silas Kane. They were talking about the woman who chose him. 3 weeks after the wedding, Silas and Nara rode north to Copperton. The journey took a day and a half. They rode side by side, and the desert stretched around them in every direction. Vast, indifferent, beautiful in its hostility. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. In the 3 weeks of living under the same roof, they had developed a language of silences, the comfortable kind, the kind that says more than words because it trusts the other person to understand what isn't spoken. They had also developed something neither of them had expected. Respect. Silas respected Nara's relentlessness. The way she rose before dawn and worked without complaint. The way she mended fences and fed livestock and organized his chaotic kitchen with a quiet efficiency that bordered on military. The way she never pitted herself, never dramatized her suffering, never asked for anything she hadn't earned. Nara respected Silas's steadiness. The way he occupied space without demanding attention. The way he listened, truly listened when she talked about Lily. The way he asked questions that showed he was thinking about her problem as if it were his own. The way he had opened his gate to a stranger and changed his entire life without asking for gratitude or explanation beyond what she'd already given. They were not in love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But they were something rarer than love in the frontier. They were allies. And in a world that had betrayed them both, that alliance felt like the sturdiest thing either of them had ever built. Copperton was a mining town. Ugly, loud, temporary feeling, like the earth itself was merely tolerating its existence. The main street was a muddy trench flanked by wooden buildings that leaned at angles suggesting they'd given up on permanence. The air smelled of sulfur and sweat and the metallic tang of ore. They checked into the town's only boarding house. A grim establishment run by a silent Mexican woman who asked no questions and offered no hospitality beyond a key and a nod. The plan was simple. File a petition with the territorial court. Present the marriage certificate. Establish Nara's legal standing. Request a custody hearing. But first they needed to find Lily. Nara had information. A letter from a woman in New Mexico who had seen Douglas working at the Monarch Mine, north of town. The letter was 3 months old. People moved fast in mining country. But it was all they had. Silas went to the mine office. He asked about Douglas Pruitt. The clerk, a nervous young man drowning in paperwork, checked his ledgers and confirmed. Douglas Pruitt was employed as a teamster. He lived in a boarding house on the south end of town. He had a child with him, a girl, about 6 years old. 6 years old. Nara had last seen Lily when she was 3. 3 years. 3 years of growing, of changing, of becoming a person Nara might not even recognize. 3 years in which Douglas had been the only parent, the only voice, the only world Lily knew. Nara's hands trembled when Silas told her. Just for a moment. Then she steadied them and said, "Take me there." They found the boarding house. A sagging, 2-story structure with a porch that groaned under their weight. Silas knocked. A woman answered, the landlady, stout, suspicious. "We're looking for Douglas Pruitt," Silas said. "He's at work. Won't be back till dark. He has a daughter, a little girl." The landlady's eyes narrowed. "What's it to you?" Nara stepped forward. "I'm her mother." Something shifted in the landlady's face. A flicker of recognition, not of Nara, but of a story. The universal story. The one that every woman in every town in every territory knew by heart but rarely spoke aloud. "She's upstairs," the landlady said quietly. "Room 4. They climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark, narrow, smelling of mildew and tobacco. Room 4 had a thin door with a rusted latch. Nara knocked. No answer. She knocked again. A small voice, thin, uncertain. "Papa." Nara's composure shattered. Not dramatically, not with sobs or wailing. It shattered the way ice shatters on a river in spring. Silently, completely, all at once. Tears ran down her face, but her voice was steady when she said, No, sweetheart. It's not Papa. A pause. Then, who is it? It's Mama. Silence. A long, terrible silence in which a 6-year-old girl on the other side of a thin door tried to reconcile a word Mama with a memory she might not even have anymore. Then the latch clicked. The door opened, and there she was, Lily, small, dark-haired, like Nara, thin, too thin, wearing a dress that was too big for her and shoes that were too small. She looked up at Nara with Douglas's blue eyes and Nara's sharp chin, and an expression of confusion so pure it was almost sacred. Nara knelt. She didn't grab the child. She didn't rush. She knelt on that filthy hallway floor and she looked at her daughter and she said, very softly, "I have been looking for you for a very long time." Lily stared at her. Then she said something that broke every heart that would ever hear this story. "Papa said you died." Nara closed her eyes. A single breath. Then she opened them and smiled. A smile that cost her everything she had and said, "Papa was wrong. They took Lily." The landlady watched them go and said nothing. But she nodded at Nara in a way that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. They made it back to the boarding house. Nara held Lily in her lap and didn't let go. Silas sat by the window, watching the street, his hand resting on the rifle propped against the wall. Because he knew. They both knew. Douglas would come home. Douglas would find the room empty. And Douglas would come looking. It was just a matter of time. They rode hard through the night. Silas pushed the horses as fast as the darkness allowed, navigating by starlight and instinct, following trails he'd ridden enough times to know by feel. Nara rode beside him with Lily pressed against her chest, the girl sleeping fitfully, waking with small frightened sounds that Nara soothed with whispers and the steady rhythm of the horse's stride. They reached Harlow Creek at dawn. The town was just waking. Smoke rising from chimneys, a dog barking somewhere, the blacksmith's hammer ringing its first notes of the day. They rode straight through without stopping, straight to the ranch, straight through the iron gate that Silas closed and locked behind them with a chain and padlock he hadn't used in years. He brought the horses into the barn. He checked every window, every door. He loaded his rifles, 3 of them, and placed them at strategic points around the house. He filled water barrels. He stacked ammunition on the kitchen table next to the salt and the coffee tin. Nara watched him work. Lily sat on the floor, eating a biscuit, studying the house with wide, cautious eyes, touching things gently as if testing whether they were real. "How long?" Nara asked. "Day, maybe 2. Depends on when he discovers she's gone. Depends on how fast he rides. He'll bring men. Probably. What do we do?" Silas looked at her. "We don't do anything. You stay inside with Lily. I handle what comes through that gate. I'm not going to hide while you're going to protect your daughter. That's not hiding. That's the most important thing happening in this house." She wanted to argue. He could see it in her jaw, in her shoulders, in the fire behind her eyes. But she looked at Lily, at this tiny, fragile, miraculous person she had crossed deserts and endured hell to find, and she nodded. Douglas Pruitt arrived on the second day. He came at noon, when the sun was highest and the heat was a living, pressing, suffocating force. He came on horseback with 3 men, rough-looking, armed, the kind of men you hired from saloons when you needed muscle and didn't care about morals. Silas saw them from the window, 4 riders approaching from the north, kicking up a column of dust that rose against the blue sky like a signal fire. He picked up his rifle, checked the chamber, and walked outside. He stood at the gate, just stood there, arms at his sides, rifle in his right hand, barrel pointed at the ground. The sun on his face, the iron fence behind him, the house behind that, and inside the house, in the back room with the cedar smell and the lavender ghost, a woman and a child who were counting on him to be exactly what the world had always accused him of being. Dangerous. The riders stopped 30 yards out. Douglas Pruitt was in front. A big man, thick-necked, sunburned, with the kind of face that might have been handsome once but had been coarsened by drink and cruelty into something hard and mean. He sat his horse and stared at Silas, and Silas stared back, and the space between them hummed like a telegraph wire. "I'm here for my daughter," Douglas said. She's not yours anymore, Silas replied. His voice was calm, almost conversational. The way you talk about the weather. The hell she ain't. I'm her father. And the woman inside is her mother. Your wife. The one you beat half to death and left in the dirt in New Mexico. Douglas's face darkened. That woman is a liar and a thief. She stole my child. Your child? Tell me something, prove it. Does a man who raises his hand to his wife and tells his daughter her mother is dead, does that man deserve the word father? One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his holster. Silas's eyes flicked to him, just for an instant, and the movement was so sharp, so precise, so full of controlled violence that the man's hand stopped moving. I don't know who you are, Douglas said, but you're making a mistake you won't live to regret. My name is Silas Kane. I own this land. The woman inside is my wife. The child is under my protection. And this? He lifted the rifle slightly, not aiming it, not yet, just adjusting its weight. Is not a negotiation. Douglas laughed. It was an ugly sound. Your wife? She married you? Christ. She really is desperate. She is. She was desperate enough to marry a stranger in a town that hates him. Ride 30 miles across hostile desert, walk into your boarding house and take back what you stole. And now she's in that house behind me, and her daughter is in her arms. And you and your 3 hired guns are on the wrong side of this fence. He paused. Let the silence build. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn around. You're going to ride back to Copperton. And next month, when the territorial court convenes, you're going to receive a custody petition filed by a legally married woman with a landowning husband and a stable home. And you're going to lose. Because every judge in this territory knows what a man like you is, even if he can't prove it. And every judge in this territory will look at that little girl, thin, frightened, wearing shoes that don't fit, and know exactly who failed her. Douglas's face had gone red. His hands were shaking. His horse sensed his rage and sidestepped nervously. You don't know me, Douglas hissed. You don't know what I'll do. I know exactly what you are, Silas said. I've known men like you my whole life. You're brave when the other person can't fight back. You're strong when the other person is smaller. But right now, right here, the person in front of you is not smaller, is not afraid, and is not going to move. He raised the rifle. Not dramatically, just smoothly, efficiently, the way a man raises a tool he knows how to use. So I'll ask you one time, are you going to ride away? Or are you going to make your daughter an orphan? The silence lasted 10 seconds. 20. 30. The desert wind pushed dust between them. The sun hammered down. One of the hired men, the youngest, quietly turned his horse and began riding away. Then another. Douglas sat there alone, his 2 remaining allies already retreating, his rage fighting his survival instinct in a war that played out across his face in real time. Then he spat in the dirt, yanked his horse's reins, and rode away. Silas stood at the gate until the dust settled, until the hoofbeats faded, until the desert was silent again, vast and indifferent and eternal. Then he lowered the rifle, and his hands, his steady, unshakable hands, trembled. Just once. The custody hearing took place 6 weeks later in Tucson. Judge William Harker presided. Nara testified. Silas testified. The widow Calloway sent a written deposition describing the beating she had witnessed. The landlady from Copperton sent a letter describing the conditions in which Lily had been kept. Douglas Pruitt, who had hired a lawyer from Phoenix, argued that Nara had abandoned the child, that she was unstable, that her new marriage was a fraud. Judge Harker listened to everything. Then he looked at Lily, who was sitting in the gallery next to Silas, holding his hand. Holding the hand of a man she had known for barely 2 months but who had stood at a gate with a rifle for her. The judge awarded full custody to Nara. Douglas Pruitt left the courthouse without a word. He was last seen boarding a train headed east. No one in Harlow Creek or Copperton ever saw him again. Silas and Nara returned to the ranch. They returned to their separate rooms, their shared meals, their comfortable silences. They returned to the life they had built. Not out of love, not at first, but out of something just as sturdy, mutual recognition. Two broken people who looked at each other and saw not a monster, not a victim, but a person. A whole, complicated, wounded, resilient person. The town of Harlow Creek did not change overnight. The whispers continued, but they were softer now. And occasionally someone, the grocer, the blacksmith's wife, old Agnes who had witnessed the wedding, would nod at Silas in the street. Not warmly exactly, but with acknowledgement, with the grudging admission that maybe, just maybe, the story they had been telling themselves for 18 years was not the whole truth. Lily grew up on that ranch. She learned to ride before she learned to read. She called Silas by his name, just Silas, until she was 9 years old. Then one morning, unprompted, unrehearsed, she looked up from her breakfast and said, "Good morning, Papa." Silas didn't react. Not visibly. He just nodded and poured her milk. But Nara saw it. She saw the way his hand paused on the pitcher. She saw the way his jaw tightened. She saw the way he turned toward the window so the light would explain the brightness in his eyes. And she knew. The curse was broken. Not by magic. Not by violence. Not by some grand redemptive gesture. It was broken by a woman who showed up at a gate, desperate enough to see clearly. And by a man who had waited 18 years for anyone, to knock. Sometimes the bravest thing in the world is not drawing a gun. It's opening a door. So tell me, what would you have done in his place? Would you have opened that gate? Or would you have let fear make the choice for you? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, if you felt something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because everyone deserves to know that the story the world tells about them isn't always the true one.